guys. I am here to talk to you about Lecture 17, which is the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is a great thing to talk about after the cardiovascular system because these two systems really work hand in hand. So the term respiration can mean a couple things. So we've talked about respiration previously in the semester when we were talking about cellular respiration, which is how cells use oxygen to make energy. And that's one meaning of the word. The other term, respiration, is used to describe how oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged between essentially the atmosphere and the cells inside the organism. And there's a couple steps to that process. So the exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere into the lungs and ultimately into the blood is called external respiration. And then the exchange between the blood and the tissues is called internal respiration, or cellular respiration. So what I mentioned just a moment ago, cellular respiration is a type of respiration, but it's not the kind of respiration that we're probably more familiar with when we say the word. The term respiration really has three different components, separate but related functions. One is ventilation, which is breathing, inspiration, expiration, that's ventilation. Two is gas exchange, which occurs between the air and the blood, and then the blood and the tissues. And then the final one would be the actual oxygen use by the tissues, using oxygen to ultimately make energy. So we're going to focus on, in our class, is ventilation and gas exchange, really. That's what we're going to be focusing our attention on. So before we do that, we just have to kind of review a little bit about the anatomy of the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is going to be composed of the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. Those two cavities meet together in the back of the throat in an area called the pharynx. And then below that is the larynx. And then we go down this tube here, which is the trachea. And then the trachea splits or bifurcates into two tubes. Those are the primary bronchi, the right and the left. And then from the primary bronchi, we go into secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, alveolar ducts, and ultimately alveoli. And the alveoli here are our tiny little air sacs that are going to be the site of gas exchange between the air in the alveoli and the blood. So oxygen is going to move from inside the alveoli into the blood, and CO2 is going to go the opposite direction, from the blood into the alveoli, and then you're going to blow it out. So all of those tubes are the airways, right? So the pharynx, larynx, trachea, primary bronchi, secondary, tertiary, alveolar ducts. Those are, I think I left out the bronchioles between the tertiary bronchi and the alveolar ducts. Those are your airways, and their job is to, basically move the air from the atmosphere down into the alveoli and then the opposite direction. So I'm going to tell you guys right now, I have the dog locked in the room with me because they're doing some tile in the kitchen, and chances of him barking are almost 100%. Okay, so there's these two terms that I want you to be very familiar with. One is external respiration and the other is internal respiration. Now, external respiration is the type of respiration that allows us to get basically gas exchanged between our lungs and our blood at the respiratory membrane. So the term pulmonary ventilation is the term that we use for the ability for oxygen to enter ultimately go all the way down into the alveoli and then exit the alveoli, and carbon dioxide to do the opposite. So if you look at our picture here, the picture is a little misleading because it looks like the lungs and this capillary bed are separate. But in reality, every single alveoli in your lungs, all those little air sacs, is wrapped with a capillary bed. And so this capillary bed, these capillary beds, these pulmonary capillaries, wrap each and every single one of your alveoli. And I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. But this process, called external respiration, occurs between the alveolar wall and the capillary. And so it's allowing oxygen to move from inside the alveoli out of the little air sac and move into the blood. It's just going to diffuse. Carbon dioxide and oxygen are very lipid soluble. They're lipophilic gases. So they're able to diffuse right across the cell membranes. So if you remember from anatomy, your alveoli is a single cell wall. And of course, your capillaries are single cell walls. And there's a basement membrane in between. That whole thing is like, 0.3 to 0.2 micrometers, if I remember correctly, and meaning very, very, very thin, like a 1/100th of the thickness of a human hair thin, like thin, we're talking thin. And so something that's really lipid soluble will be able to diffuse super efficiently, provided that there's pressure and or a concentration gradient. So oxygen in external respiration, oxygen moves out of the alveoli and into the blood, and CO2 goes the opposite, out of the blood and into the alveoli. If you remember from our cardiovascular lectures that we've had, the blood that's coming to the lungs for this to happen, for this gas exchange to occur, is coming from the right side of the heart. So it's CO2 heavy and O2 light. So it's got more carbon dioxide in here than there is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere ultimately. And the carbon dioxide moves from high concentration to low, and the oxygen in the alveoli is in high concentration. In this venous blood that's coming from the oxygen poor blood that's coming from the right side of the heart, the oxygen levels are higher in the alveoli than they are in the blood, and the oxygen diffuses from high concentration to low. So this process of external respiration is the gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. Though I think the term external is a little confusing, because when we see the term external, we think it's outside of the body, and it's not. It's happening at the respiratory membrane, the interface between the alveolar walls and the capillary walls. The other part of this is internal respiration. I'm going to go back to my picture for a second that I just showed you. So down here, right? So this blood in these pulmonary capillaries then they pick up oxygen, they get rid of CO2, and then they travel to the left side of the heart. And from the left side of the heart, this oxygenated blood is pumped systemically, and it leaves, as we know, through the left ventricle, through the aorta, then into the large arteries, smaller arteries, arterioles, and then into the capillaries. So this internal respiration occurs between our systemic capillary beds, of which we've got, trillions, and our body cells. So it's the gas exchange between your systemic capillaries, which as the blood moves into the capillary bed, it's oxygen rich, right? The oxygen hasn't left the blood since it left the lungs. And the oxygen moves, this highly oxygenated blood moves into this capillary. Oxygen is going to diffuse out of the blood and into the tissues, and then into our, cells, so they can use that oxygen to make ATP, right? Cellular respiration, internal respiration, and CO2, which is produced as a waste product, moves into the capillary. And then ultimately it's going to travel back to the right side of the heart in venous blood, right? So those two things are extremely important, right? The whole purpose of the respiratory system is not to get oxygen into the lungs. The whole purpose of the respiratory system is to get oxygen into the blood so that it can then be pumped via the pump, the cardiovascular system, pumped so it can go into the to the tissues, so it can be delivered to the tissues. And the carbon dioxide that we're producing as a waste, we need to get it out of our body, right? So it's a metabolic byproduct that we need to excrete, essentially. And the most efficient way to excrete the carbon dioxide is to breathe it out. So the whole purpose of respiration or ventilation, breathing in and breathing out, is to ultimately get oxygen to a place where it can be used and get carbon dioxide out of the body. All right, so we've got these airways. The airways get broken down or divided into different zones. I fear the dog is going to start to bark in a moment, you guys. Apologize in advance. It gets broken down into different zones. So we're going to start with the conducting zone, and then we terminate with the respiratory zone. So up here, we have, above here would be the, pharynx, larynx, and then into the trachea. It's still one tube, so you see no branches. The trachea then splits into the primary bronchi, one on each side, right and left. Once we go into the primary bronchi, we're now entering into the lungs. Each primary bronchi enters into the lungs. I want to mention that there's cartilage in the trachea, there's cartilage in the primary bronchi, which give them kind of a cylindrical shape and supports those tubes so they don't collapse. When we continue to go down, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, and then we go into the bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles, so we're now at the end of, and you see they branch a ton. So we branch here, after the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary, bronchioles, even more branching, and then we get into the terminal bronchioles, which branch a ton. The terminal bronchioles are the first airway branches that don't have any more cartilage, so they're not cartilaginous. And then also in the terminary bronchioles, after the terminary bronchioles, we'll move into the respiratory bronchioles. And you notice these little blips here. The respiratory bronchioles are the first site where we're starting to see some alveoli begin to appear. You see them kind of like pouching off of here. Another thing to mention is as we get into these bronchioles, the bronchioles have quite a lot of smooth muscle wrapped around them. And especially as we get into kind of those bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles, they have a lot of smooth muscle wrapped around them. And that smooth muscle can contract or relax, and that will alter the radius of the tube. We know that bronchioles will contract in response to irritation from particulate, and they do that to protect essentially the alveoli, the air sacs in the lungs, from any potentially damaging material that might get in there. So it's a way of it's a mode of protection. You guys probably remember, learning in anatomy that, and I should have said this as we were going into the airway, we have quite a lot of cilia. The epithelial cells there are ciliated, and the cilia helps to kind of trap particulate as well. All right, so where are we? Okay, so the transition from the conducting zone to the respiratory zone happens here between the terminal bronchioles and the respiratory bronchioles. And then from the respiratory bronchioles, we move into the alveolar ducts. And at the end of the alveolar ducts, we have all of the alveolar sacs. So the alveoli is where the gas exchange can potentially occur, but it only can occur if there's a capillary on the other side. So really what's happening between the alveoli and the capillaries, the blood in the capillaries, is we're exchanging material. So as we branch and branch and branch and branch, what that ultimately does is that one, causes a tremendous amount of surface area for gas exchange. And remember, when we learned about diffusion, one of the things that, and I think I used this example at that time, one of the things that will greatly enhance the ability of something to diffuse if there's a concentration gradient is a large surface area. So we have a tremendous amount of surface area for diffusion to occur. There's, an estimated, I don't know, I think about 300 million tiny little alveolar sacs, those pulmonary alveoli, 300 million. And if I remember correctly, if you were to take all of your respiratory membrane out and flatten it out, it would be greater than the size of a tennis court. And so that's a lot of surface area. And so we are, and it kind of, one of the things I like to think about when I'm thinking about just gas exchange and gas and oxygen delivery is really how exquisitely created we are to deliver oxygen to our tissues, right? It gives you another idea of just how important. Remember, we talked about this when I talked about blood and how much heat and how much oxygen your red blood cells are capable of carrying, right? How much hemoglobin is packed into each and every single red blood cell. So it gives us an idea of just really how important oxygen is to us, right? All right, so continuing on, here we have a picture of the alveoli. And remember, like I said, the total surface area of alveoli in contact with capillaries, and the capillary is a big important part of it. So when you cut through here, you can see on the outside the capillary network. So remember, these capillaries are single cell walled, and the alveoli is a single cell wall. I'm going to show you the next picture, a little bit more detail of the inside of the alveoli. So this is the site, and you can see from the terminal bronchioles to the respiratory bronchioles, we start to see some alveoli sticking out of those guys, and then the alveolar ducts, and then they terminate into these alveolar sacs, which are just, like kind of, I always sort of think about grapes on a stem, right? So all the grapes at the bottom of that woody stem would represent the individual alveolar sacs. And again, this is the site of gas exchange, and it has this tremendous, tremendous surface area. There are pores, you notice in here, there are pores called alveolar pores in between the alveoli. And what that allows for is it allows for air to move from alveoli to alveoli. It's kind of like like if you go to, sometimes in hotel rooms, there's a door between two hotel rooms. And if you can open that door, you can kind of go through that way rather than having to go out the door and then around. So it's kind of the same idea. It allows for an opportunity that permits the flow of air from alveoli to alveoli. And this becomes a really important feature of the respiratory system when an alveolus or an alveolar duct might be blocked by some kind of a respiratory disease, like, for example, emphysema is a good one, or chronic bronchitis, or even in some cases asthma. When those diseases are classified as our chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, and that means there's some obstruction to airflow, whether it's in or out of in most cases, alveolar ducts, or maybe in an individual alveoli. And what that does is it allows air, if it gets in here, it allows air to pass from alveoli to the neighboring alveoli, which can come in really handy. All right, so here's a little bit of a deeper look into the actual alveoli. And so if you look in here, right, this is the inside of the sac, excuse me, there's two types of cells. The cells that make up the wall, primarily all these guys, those are called type 1 cells. And then this guy over here, this kind of greenish looking one, that's called a type 2 cells. So the type 1 cells make up roughly between, probably almost 100%, probably more like, 96, 97, 95, 97% of the total surface area of the lungs are type 1 cells. Type 1 pneumocytes is the fancy name for those cells. And they are incredibly thin, And therefore, they are the cells that allow for gas exchange. So most of the gas that exchanges across the walls of the alveoli and ultimately into the capillaries is going to diffuse right across the walls, of the type 1 cells. And remember, I'll come to that in a minute. The other cell here is the type 2 cell. That's these kind of little green guys. Those type 2 cells are cells that secrete a substance called pulmonary surfactant. Surfactant is kind of like an emulsifying agent, sort of. And what it does in the lungs is it decreases surface tension. It makes it so the lungs, when you breathe in, they don't overinflate and potentially pop. And when you expire, they don't totally collapse. So the surfactant, it decreases the surface tension, right? So it allows the lungs to not the alveoli, individual alveoli, not to overinflate and also not to collapse. It's a really important player. Surfactant is produced kind of at a steady state all through our lives. It's interesting to point out that babies that are born prematurely oftentimes have respiratory issues. And one of the reasons why that is so common is because for one, the respiratory system is our last system to develop in utero, which makes sense because we don't breathe air in there, so there's no real need to get the lungs, up and running first thing. There's lots of other things to deal with first. But two, once the lungs do develop, the last cells, the final cells to, do their deal and mature are the type 2 pneumocytes. So if a baby is born prematurely, occasionally they don't have adequate surfactant or any at all if the baby's very premature. And what that means is the very first breath of air doesn't happen, because in order for the alveoli to expand on the very first inhalation, when the baby is now out in an atmosphere where there's actually oxygen, they can't overcome the surface tension, right? It takes a lot of, think if you've ever blown up a balloon, right? Especially if there's a balloon that has a little bit of water in there, if it's a little bit wet, you start to blow and you really have to work hard. It's the same kind of a deal, right? You're overcoming the surface tension to inflate that balloon. And so when the babies go to take their first breath in, they can't actually inflate the alveoli because of the lack of surfactant. So it's a big issue. Damage to the rest, after a baby has born, if everything's fine, you can still have issues with surfactant. And that can happen if there's some kind of a nasty respiratory infection, including like the COVID-19 virus that has been, really we've been on the forefront of all of our minds. That's one of the issues that we see is, in addition to all the other stuff, the insult to the lungs can cause damage to those cells and can cause decrease in the production of surfactant. The disorder that affects adults as a result of surfactant loss is called adult respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. If you've ever seen that, that's what's happening there. Okay, one other thing I want to mention here is the respiratory membrane. So what you're seeing in this picture, and I think this is a very important picture to have in your mind, this is the interface between the alveolar wall here and the capillary wall here. And then in the middle here is the basement membrane. So we have a situation where we have these air sacs that have a wall that's single cell thickness, right? And then we have a capillary on the other side that's a single cell. And then we have a very thin basement membrane there. And that distance across that entire respiratory membrane is somewhere, I mentioned earlier, somewhere between 0.2 and 0.3 micrometers, which again is about 1/100th the width of a human hair. So this is as thin as you can imagine. All right. And that's something I want you to have in your mind, a working knowledge of what the respiratory membrane is all about. So if you're at this point not sure about that, pause for a second and go back and kind of think about that. So when I say the respiratory membrane, that includes the alveolar wall, the basement membrane, and the capillary wall. I'm not sure if you guys are hearing that sound, and I'm sorry, they're putting tile in my kitchen. Okay, so we have here a picture showing us the lungs and the thoracic wall. So when we talk about the respiratory system, we kind of have to be aware of a bunch of pressures. And I don't want to get too hung up on them, all the numbers and everything, but I just want you to kind of have an idea of what this all means. All right, so what you see here is, you see in purple, these are our lungs. Each lung is surrounded by a closed sac. And this sac is called, this space, pardon me, is called the pleural space, or the pleural cavity. And the sac consists of a very thin sheet of pleural cells. Excuse me. So it's a kind of like a double membrane. So you've got the pleural cavity has a surface thin layer of cells that sits right on the lung tissue, and then another that lines the thoracic cavity, and you can kind of see it there. So we call the pleural membrane that sits on the lungs, we call that the visceral pleura. And the one that attaches to the thoracic cavity, we call that the parietal pleura. And then the space in between is the pleural space, or the pleural cavity. And there's a little bit of fluid in here, not a lot of fluid, a tiny little bit of fluid that separates those two layers. Right? It allows for the two membranes to kind of slide on one another without creating a lot of friction. It's a serous fluid in there, if you remember from anatomy. So that fluid, surrounds the lungs, and it lubricates the surfaces so that they can slide over one another when you're breathing. Because when you're breathing, your chest cavity is inflating and then it's deflating. So a way to visualize this would be if you kind of think about, like, if you have two slides in the lab, two glass slides, and you get a little drop, they stick together, but if you put a little bit of fluid on them, they'll slide, one glass slide slides on the other. All right. So when we talk about these pressures, we've got a bunch of pressures to kind of keep track of. One is the pressure of the gases in the atmosphere, in the air that you're breathing. So that pressure is referred to as atmospheric pressure. Then when we come down here, we're going to have pressure inside of the lungs, and that pressure is referred to as intra-alveolar pressure. And then we have the pressure that exists in the pleural space, and that's called intrapleural pressure. And then we have the pressure difference between the intraalveolar pressure and the intrapleural pressure, and that pressure is called transpulmonary pressure. So if you just kind of look at some numbers here, just to get an idea, you notice that the intraalveolar pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury. The intrapleural pressure is about 756 millimeters of mercury. So the difference means there's a little bit more pressure in here, about 4 millimeters of mercury, more pressure in here than here. So we've got a lot more pressure out here. So we have pressure out here, then we have pressure here and pressure here. And so when we start to kind of talk about movement of air, air moves from one place to another, or gases, I should say. Gas moves from one place to another based on pressure gradients, pressure differences. And that's kind of the driving force for ventilation. So again, this is a picture that kind of just revisits what we were talking about with external respiration and internal respiration. So again, the steps of external respiration is getting air to move from the atmosphere into the alveoli, and what's gonna basically pull oxygen in here is the pressure gradient. A higher pressure of oxygen out here, a lower pressure of oxygen in here. Oxygen comes in here, right? And then oxygen will be exchanged between the alveolar walls and the capillary walls at the site of interface called the respiratory membrane, and oxygen will move in. At the same time, CO2 is going the opposite direction. You've got the gradient for CO2 is reverse. You have higher CO2 here than here, so CO2 moves out of the blood and into the alveoli, and then you ultimately blow it out. All right, now we've got oxygenated blood that's going to go to the left side of the heart, then it's going to get pumped out of the left side of the heart, and it's going to be delivered to your systemic capillaries, where oxygen will move from high pressure, which is in the blood, into the cells, and CO2 will move from the cells into the blood. And then we go right back and do it all over again. All right, so in order to get air into and out of the alveoli, we do this, air will move, gases will move because of pressure gradients. So the way air moves into and out of the alveoli is by bulk flow, which is just, the big movement of something driven, of things, in this case gases, driven by pressure gradients. So our respiratory gases, which are CO2 and O2, will always move via bulk flow because they can. They're lipid soluble from a region of high pressure for that gas to a region of low pressure for that gas. So the pressure gradients are created by changes in the actual physical shape of the thoracic cavity. So when we start to look at the numbers for pressure, we want to say that all of these numbers are given relative to atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury, but the atmospheric pressure will decrease as you increase in altitude. So when you see this word, this number 760 millimeters of mercury, we're talking about at sea level. So at sea level, atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. The pressure in the alveoli is less. So the air will move from atmosphere, the oxygen, I should say, which atmospheric concentration of oxygen is high, oxygen will move into the alveoli. So then the alveolar pressure ultimately will become greater than 760 millimeters of mercury, and that's going to ultimately cause the air to go out. So during ventilation, which is inspiration, expiration, air moves into and out of the lungs because alveolar pressure is less when it's moving in and it's greater when moving out. All right, so to try to understand these pressure changes, we want to look at this law called Boyle's Law. So basically, Boyle's Law helps us to understand how if you change the dimensions of a cavity, in this case the lungs, that will cause a change in the pressure, in this case alveolar pressure. So this is a basic physiological principle, and it's called Boyle's Law. And so you see that Boyle's Law states that the pressure of a gas is inversely related to its volume as long as temperature stays the same. And that's what this formula is. Pressure 1, volume 1 equals pressure 2, volume 2. So as you increase the volume of the container, or I should say, as you increase the volume of the container, so as we apply this to the human, as we increase the size of our thoracic cavity, the pressure inside there goes down. If you decrease the volume, like when you expire, when you decrease the volume of the container, the pressure inside there goes up. So how this applies to us humans is during inspiration and expiration, the volume of the container, which is the lungs, the thoracic cavity, changes. And these changes ultimately cause changes to alveolar pressure, which then will influence how the air flows into or out of the lungs. So here's a picture. So when you breathe in during inspiration, the chest wall expands, right? And so when you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts, this big U-shaped muscle at the bottom of your ribs, and it moves down. The muscles in between your ribs, the intercostals, contract, and it pulls the thoracic cavity out this way. So it not only gets bigger this way, but it gets bigger this way. So the volume of that container now has gone up, and the pressure inside there goes down. And now we have this big gradient from atmospheric, between the atmosphere and intraalveolar pressure. So as the chest wall expands, the expansion is really the alveoli expanding. The pressure in the alveoli goes down, and air gets sucked in from the atmosphere to re-equalize the pressure, essentially. So what's driving these changes in pressure is changes in the actual size of the thoracic cavity, which is driven primarily by the contraction of the muscles, right? So the internal intercostals, when they contract, they pull the ribs up. The diaphragm, when it contracts, it moves down, right? And so when that happens, it causes the whole chest cavity to change shape as well. And that's what drives, essentially, without getting into all the numbers, but that's what drives the movement of air from the atmosphere into the lungs and ultimately out again, inspiration, expiration. So the inspiration is the contraction of the intercostals. I think I might have said internal on the previous slide, and I meant to say external, the ones outside. The external intercostals and the diaphragm, those are the changes that cause the chest cavity to expand, the chest wall and the lungs to expand, and the pressure goes down. So oxygen gets pulled in to the lungs. When you expire, the diaphragm relaxes, the external intercostals relax, and the internal intercostals will and the abdominal muscles will contract a bit, and that will kind of push the rib cage back down and force air out when the diaphragm kind of recoils back up like to a U shape. So the contraction of the skeletal muscles change the volume of the thoracic cavity. So in order for us to be able to do this, to breathe, to ventilate, we have to have control of those skeletal muscles. So here's another one. Again, I just told you this, but you can see with inspiration, the diaphragm and the inspiratory or the external intercostals contract, the thorax expands, the lung expands, and we see a decrease in the pressure in there, which will pull air in. And then the flip side of that is exhalation, when the diaphragm and the inspiratory intercostals stop contracting, the chest wall will recoil inward and the diaphragm will recoil back up, and it will force air out. The air in the alveoli is actually compressed when the lungs recoil, and that results in an increase in alveolar pressure, and it pushes the air back out again. So it's kind of, it's not really complicated. It's more just physics, right? It's more about understanding that Boyle's law, again, which says as the pressure increases, as the size of the cavity increases, the pressure inside there goes down. As the cavity decreases, the pressure inside there goes up. Okay, so this process of getting air into the alveoli is referred to as alveolar ventilation, which is most precisely the volume of new air that reaches the alveoli every minute. And you can see at rest, it's about roughly 4 liters or 4,200 mils per minute. And this is going to be determined by what the volume of each breath is, and then how many times they're breathing in a minute. And then we have to take out of the volume of gas that's basically air that's in the conduction tubing, that's not actually in the air in the alveoli. That space is called the dead space. So no gas exchange can occur in the dead space. Gas can only be exchanged at the alveoli. So any air that's in the conducting in those conducting tubes isn't able to actually take place in gas exchange. All right, so let's see. So when we breathe in, each inhale is about 350 mils of freshly inspired air. Or I should say, of every breath we breathe in, about 350 mils of that air will actually make it to the respiratory surface. So if we need to increase oxygen delivery to the blood, we need to get more oxygen delivery to the blood at the respiratory membrane, right? If that's our goal, to get more oxygen into our blood. Our options are to either take bigger breaths, increase the volume per breath, or change the number of breaths per minute. Those are our choices. And it turns out that changing the depth of breathing, the volume of each breath, is much more efficient than actually increasing the rate at which you breathe, which kind of makes sense. If you're breathing very quickly, you tend to be, moving a smaller volume of air, but doing it fast. So changing the actual depth of the breath is the more efficient way to go. Okay, so I think I'm going to actually stop here, and then I'm going to pick this one up on the next video. There's kind of a lot of noise happening in my house.